Okay, so sharing my screen here now. Is it visible to all? Okay, good. Okay, so we are discussing about the network address translation. So the first thing that we can say about the network address translation is nothing but we can say it's a process only, right? Which we can say that which has one or more local IP address, which can translate it into the global IP address, right? And one thing we can say that it also does the translation of the port numbers, that is masking of the port numbers of the host with the another port number, right? So the original port number is there and another mask, another number that is given to that, that is we can say masking is performed on that, right? So in the packet that will be routed to the destination and there are NAT table जैसे routing table होता है forwarding table होता है वैसे ही एक network address translation table होता है that is used that whatever the IP address that is translated from the local IP address to the global IP address that keeps a record of all that, right? So that is the network address translation. So let's check the PPT. Okay, so we have seen this part, right, in the last lecture. ये subnetting में अगर आपको उसका reference चाहिए, so you can take a reference of this PPT. So we have seen this already. Network address, ये भी हमने देखा था कल, right? Network address translation, right? So remapping of an IP address place into an another by modifying the network address information. So we can say that translating the one IP address to an another IP address, or we can use the term remapping of an IP address space into an another, right? So this is all about the NAT. जैसे मैंने बोला कि NAT जैसे forwarding table होता है, routing table होता है, so that NAT has also its table. That is called, we can say it's a NAT table that keeps a record of the internal IP addresses which are there on the computer, on which are there on the network. Right? So it keeps a record of all that. So you can see here all IP datagrams living local network have same single source NAT IP address. And when it is entering into the another into an another network, it make use of its local IP address. जब वो बाहर होता है किसी network से, so it make use of a public IP address. But when it enters into its private network, it make use of its own local private IP address, right? So जैसे ही वो अपने network में enter होता है, वो अपना खुद का IP address use करता है. That is a private IP address. So this is all about the NAT, we can say. Now, there are two things that needs to be understand for the we can say network inside IP address and network outside IP address. So net inside IP address and net outside IP address. So first of all, we'll look at that part. So net inside IP address. If I say inside refers to the addresses which must be translated. That when any hosts which are there inside the network. So it makes use of its local IP address. But when it moves outside the network, it makes use of the another IP address. And for that, we need to have some translation. We need to follow some translation technique, right? So one thing we can say that कि जो inside IP address है, that is referred to as that needs to be translated. But if I say about the outside, जो addresses outside use होता है, that is we can say that is not in the control of the organization, right? Organization उसे control नहीं कर सकता है. But जो organization के अंदर जो address use किया जाता है, we can say that are controlled by the organization कि वो translate करने के लिए permit देता है, right? So one thing we can say that the outside refers to the address which are not in the control of an organization, and these are the network addresses in which the translation of the addresses will be done. Now, inside local address, inside global address. Now, inside local address. So, an IP address that is assigned to a host on the inside network. जो भी IP address एक host को assign किया जाता है, that is on the internal side, that is an inside local address. And this address is probably not an IP address assigned by the service provider. That is, these are the private address. जैसे मैंने बोला कि जो भी address को एक ऑर्गेनाइजेशन के अंदर यूज किया जाता है फॉर दैट स्पेसिफिक पर्पस, that address is referred to as a local IP address, right? Or we can say the private IP address. And this is the inside host seen from the inside network, right? So that is, we can say, inside local address, which is referred to as an private IP address. Another one is inside global address. So this IP address represents one or more inside local IP address to the outside world, right? And this is, we can say, this is the inside host that can be seen to the outside network, right? Another one is outside local address and outside global address. So concept is the same. We can say outside local address is nothing but we can say this is an actual address of the destination host in the local network after the translation. After the translation process is performed, after the network address translation, that process is performed on any addresses, that is, we can say, that is the actual IP address of the destination, where the packet is stressed from the source host to the destination host. Global outside global address, that is, we can say, this is the outside host as seen from the outside network, and it is the IP address of the outside destination host before the translation. Right? Before translation, this IP address is used. Now, there are mainly three ways to configure the net. Right? Net को अगर configure करना है, then there are three ways: static net, dynamic net, and port address translation. Right? Port address translation, that is, we can say, somewhat similar to that of port masking, as I said before. Right? So let's see one by one. the static net. We static, that is, we can say that it in this a single unregistered IP address is mapped with the legally registered IP address. Unregistered IP address मतलब कि कोई ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में जो IP एड्रेस यूज किया जाता है, प्राइवेट IP एड्रेस, that is mapped legally with the registered public IP address, that is one-to-one mapping between the local and global address. And one thing we can say that this is generally used for web hosting. ये generally web hosting के लिए use किया जाता है, right? And these are not used by any organization, as there are, we can say, many devices on the network who needs to access the internet by using this IP address, right? And this is nothing but, we can say, provide an internet access to the users. The public IP address is required, right? So here one-to-one mapping is done. One-to-one mapping of what? Unregistered private IP address with legally registered public IP address. So we can write certain points about this. Then next is dynamic net. तो डायनेमिक नेट में क्या होगा कि अनरजिस्टर्ड आईपी एड्रेस है, that will be translated into the registered IP address. तो वो कहाँ से होगा? From the pool of public IP address. So if the IP address of the pool is not free, then the packet will be dropped as an only a fixed number of private IP address and can be translated into the public addresses as well, right? So यहाँ पे क्या है कि जो unregistered IP address है, that is translated into an registered IP address. So let's say that if there are two pools of a public IP address, then only two private IP addresses can be translated at a given time. And if the third private IP address wants to access the internet, then the packet will be dropped.
Therefore, we can say that many private addresses are mapped to the pool of public IP address, and NAT is used for just, we can say, the translation process. So we can say like that if there are two, if there is a pool of two public IP address, then only two private address can be translated. Now, the another one is port address translation. So we can say this is also known as NAT overload. और ये किसके लिए यूज होता है? वी कैन से in this we can say many local, that is a private IP address, can be translated to a single registered IP address. So we can say translation of local private IP address to a single registered IP address. So this is all about the NAT, that is the network address translation. So today we'll keep up to this. उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट टॉपिक है दैट इज आईसीएमपी, टाइप्स ऑफ कोड, ट्रेस रूट, यानी कि पूरा वो आईसीएमपी में ही आ जाएगा. एंड देयर आर टू राउटिंग एल्गोरिदम दैट इज रिमेनिंग, दैट इज डिस्टेंस वेक्टर एंड हायरार्किकल, राइट. सो वो हम कर लेंगे, कल हमारा लेक्चर है. सो विल ट्राई टू कंप्लीट दिस इन दैट लेक्चर ओनली. Okay, TP1 class. 1, 2,
Present, ma'am.
3, 4,
Yes, ma'am.
5,
Yes, ma'am.
6,
Present.
7,
Present.
10,
Present, ma'am.
12, 13, 15,
Present, ma'am.
17, 19,
Present, ma'am.
20,
Present, ma'am.
21,
Present, ma'am.
22,
Present,
यार
ma'am.
मैं मीटिंग में क्या कर रहा हूँ?
24, 25,
Ma'am, 24 present, ma'am. 24.
26, 27. Yes, one more thing that I want to announce in your class.